They ignored my dad in the ER because of how he looked, until he saved a life that night, but before we get to that moment, you need to understand how it all began, and why I can't forget a single detail from that day, no matter how hard I try. It started in the kitchen, just before dinner, when I saw blood on the floor, and my mom, already in panic, grabbed the first towel she could find, pressed it against the wound, and screamed for me to grab the keys while she fumbled with her phone to call emergency service, her voice shaking more than her hands as she begged them to hurry. The drive to the ER didn't take long, 15 minutes, maybe less, but the whole time I kept glancing at him in the back seat, where he sat hunched over, holding the towel tighter and tighter, sweat beading on his forehead, his lips slightly parted, breathing just a bit too fast to feel right, and though he didn't say a word, I could tell something else was wrong. When we got to the emergency room, the doors slid open like they always do, but this time it felt slower, like even the hospital itself didn't want to let us in, and as soon as we crossed the threshold, my mom shouted for help. Her voice was loud, clear, desperate, but the 3 nurses behind the counter barely reacted. One looked up and blinked before returning her gaze to the monitor, another kept scrolling on her phone, and the third finally stood, not to rush over or ask what happened, but to calmly point toward the sign-in sheet and say, without even making eye contact, "You'll have to take a seat and wait to be called." My mom, trying to hold it together, raised her voice, insisting he needed help immediately. "He's bleeding, he's in pain, he's not okay," but all she got was a tired look and a repeat of the same line, "Triage is busy. Please take a seat." So we did. My dad slumped into one of those hard plastic chairs, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and kept his head down, the towel still pressed to his hand, which had soaked through completely by then, and even though he was right there, silent, sweating, and clearly struggling, no one came, no one asked anything, no one even acknowledged him. I remember watching as a man in khakis walked in 5 minutes later, holding his elbow like he'd just pulled a muscle playing tennis, and before he even finished signing his name, 2 nurses were already leading him through the double doors with soft smiles and nods, and a few minutes after that, a woman clutching her stomach was taken back in less than 3 minutes, but my dad, sitting there, dark-skinned, quiet, and visibly unwell, stayed invisible. I kept looking at the clock on the wall, because that's all I could do, and I remember it hitting 15 minutes, then 20, then 35, and every second that passed made me more confused, more angry, because I knew if he looked different, dressed different, maybe even talked different, someone would have come. At 42 minutes, everything changed. He went quiet, not just quiet, but empty, like something inside him had powered down, and his head rolled back slowly, his chest barely moving, and that's when my mom stood up like lightning, ran to the desk again, and screamed that he wasn't breathing right, that she thought he was having a heart attack, that someone needed to do something now. The nurse behind the counter didn't even flinch, she just frowned like we were disturbing her peace and said, "Ma'am, please don't raise your voice in the waiting area." And then, right in the middle of that sentence, my dad collapsed. He slid out of the chair and hit the floor hard, like all the weight inside him gave out at once, and for the first time that night, I heard gasps from people around us, heard someone scream, saw heads turn, saw nurses jump to their feet like they'd finally woken up, and while my mom dropped to her knees beside him, crying his name, everything turned to chaos. For a second, the room froze. Maybe just the sudden, terrifying silence that followed, but everything stopped, just for a moment, like time itself didn't know what to do next. And then, chaos. Nurses who had ignored us for almost an hour suddenly jumped into motion, shouting for a crash cart, calling out vitals, tearing open his shirt, placing pads on his chest, and moving with the kind of urgency they should have shown 42 minutes earlier. My mom was pushed back, her hands still shaking, her lips trembling, eyes wide with panic, and I could see her trying to hold herself together but falling apart at the same time, frozen in a state between hope and absolute fear. I stood in the corner, out of the way, watching them work on my dad right there on the cold tile floor, in front of everyone, in the same spot where he had begged silently for help with his eyes, in the same waiting room where he had been invisible just moments before. Now, suddenly, he mattered. Now they saw him. Not because they cared, but because he had collapsed. They finally moved him into a room, and we weren't allowed to follow. A nurse told my mom to sit down, told her someone would come speak with us soon, and then she disappeared behind the double doors with the others, leaving us in the same chairs we had waited in for nearly an hour. Now, the room was quiet. Now, people were staring at us, not ignoring us like before, but looking at us with that mix of pity and discomfort that says they know something awful just happened, but they'd really rather not be involved. I glanced over at the man in the khakis, the one with the sore elbow. He was sitting 3 chairs away, no longer smirking, no longer relaxed. His eyes were fixed on the floor. A little girl tugged at her mom's sleeve across the room and whispered, "Mommy, what happened to that man?" Her mom shushed her without answering, and I thought, yeah, you won't explain it, because you can't. A doctor came out 25 minutes later. He looked exhausted, and when he said, "We were able to stabilize him," I swear I heard my mom exhale for the first time in what felt like years. The doctor said Dad would need further testing, possibly surgery, but that he was conscious and asking for us. We were led back to a small room where he lay connected to monitors, and 4 in his arm, oxygen running under his nose. He looked tired, but alive. My mom rushed to his side, kissed his forehead, held his hand, and whispered things I couldn't hear. I just stood at the edge of the bed, not knowing what to say. I felt guilty, like I should have done something. Like I should have yelled louder. Demanded more. Pushed harder. But then, my dad turned his head, looked at me, and said something I didn't expect. "Is the boy okay?" At first, I didn't understand. I looked around, confused. "What boy?" I asked. He nodded toward the hallway. "The one they brought in after me. The car crash." That's when it clicked. While they were working on him, someone else had been rushed in, a teenage boy, pale and covered in blood. I remembered seeing him wheeled past in a blur while we were sitting outside his room, but I hadn't paid attention. Dad had. Even in the middle of everything, in pain, barely breathing, he noticed someone else. That's just who he is. The room was quiet except for the soft beeping of the heart monitor and the low hum of the oxygen machine. My dad was staring at the ceiling now, his chest rising slowly, his face pale but calmer than it had been all night. My mom stayed close, brushing her hand across his forehead, whispering prayers under her breath, and I just stood there, still holding on to what he had said a few minutes ago, not about himself, not about what they'd done to him, but about the other boy, the one they'd rushed in while we were stuck waiting, the one he saw through half-closed eyes, even when no one was seeing him. I stepped outside the room. I don't know why, maybe I just needed air, maybe I needed to see if that boy was even real, but something pulled me toward the hallway, and as soon as I rounded the corner, I saw a nurse wheeling out a gurney, empty now. She looked rushed, panicked even, and when she passed by, I heard her mutter something under her breath, something about, no attending, no coverage, trauma team stuck in surgery. I walked slowly toward the room they had pulled him into. The door was open. Inside, I saw him, maybe 16, 17 at most, lying motionless on the bed, face bruised, shirt cut open, chest barely rising. He looked like he had been in a car accident, just like my dad said. But what got me, what made my stomach twist, was that he was alone. No family. No doctor. Just one nurse checking vitals and adjusting machines, her hands shaking, her eyes darting between monitors. She turned when she saw me and said, "I'm sorry, this room is off limits," but her voice cracked, and I could hear the fear behind it. Not anger. Not authority. Fear. I glanced at the boy again. His lips were turning blue. The nurse looked like she didn't know what to do next. There's no trauma doctor available. The team's stuck in the OR. We're trying to stabilize him, but we need a surgeon. That's when it hit me. I turned and ran back to my dad's room, nearly knocking over a cart in the hallway. I burst through the door, breathing hard. "Dad," I said, "they need help. It's that boy, the one from the crash. They don't have a doctor for him." My mom stood up fast. What are you talking about? I looked at my dad. And he looked at me. There was a beat, just a second, maybe two, but I swear something changed in his face. That quiet strength I knew, the one that had carried me through everything in my life, suddenly came back. He sat up a little straighter, winced, but didn't stop. "Help me up," he said. "Dad," I hesitated. "You just had a heart." "Help me up." We helped him into a wheelchair. He was still weak, still hooked up to monitors, but he pulled the 4-line from his arm without flinching, and when we pushed him down the hall toward that room, the nurses looked at us like we were crazy. One of them shouted, "Sir, you can't be here," but my dad just held up a hand and said, "I'm a surgeon. Let me see the boy." The hallway seemed twice as long on the way back. My dad sat upright in the wheelchair, one hand gripping the armrest, the other pressing against his chest like he was holding something in place, like if he let go, something inside would unravel. My mom walked beside him, unsure whether to stop this or trust it, torn between fear and instinct. And me, I pushed him fast, ignoring the looks from nurses, the voices behind us telling us we couldn't be in this area, that we had to turn around, that this wasn't allowed. But he kept moving forward. He didn't even flinch when the doors to the trauma bay opened and the cold fluorescent light hit his face. Inside, it was chaos, organized chaos, but chaos all the same. The boy on the bed was barely conscious now, oxygen mask on his face, skin pale and lips still tinted blue. Machines beeped in uneven rhythms. 2 nurses hovered around him, one trying to insert another 4, the other flipping through a clipboard like she was hoping it would suddenly give her answers. They all turned when we entered. One of them, a younger nurse with tired eyes and a nervous tone, stepped forward and said, "Sir, I'm sorry, this area is restricted. You're not authorized to." My dad raised his voice for the first time that night. "Then find someone who is," he said firmly, his voice sharp but controlled. "Then say so, that you don't mind watching him lose his only hope for life." The room froze. The boy's monitor gave a long, slow beep. His heart rate was dropping. The nurse looked at the screen, then at the boy, then at my dad, and for a moment I saw something in her face shift, fear turning into hesitation, hesitation into recognition, like maybe, just maybe, she saw something in him that wasn't just another patient. "We called trauma," she said. "They're still in surgery. The on-call physician isn't responding. We're trying." My dad leaned forward in the chair, his breath tight, but his focus razor sharp. "What meds has he had? What are his stats? Where's his imaging? We don't have any pictures yet." They rushed to him immediately and we couldn't even get him to a stable condition. My dad cut her off with a steady, quiet command. "Get me a central line kit. Crash cart open. And suction ready." The room held its breath. One nurse, the older one, silent until now, finally moved. She opened the crash cart. The younger one followed, almost on instinct, passing over the kit without arguing. My dad nodded once, then looked at me. "Help me stand." I froze. "Now." I moved behind him, bracing his back, and helped lift him from the chair. He swayed for a moment, one hand grabbing the bed rail, the other gripping my shoulder. But then he steadied. Just like that, as if he hadn't just collapsed on a waiting room floor less than an hour ago, he stood tall over that boy, eyes scanning the monitor, taking in every beep, every rise and fall of the chest, every hesitation in the machine's rhythm. The nurses hovered, waiting. And then, he spoke. "We don't have time for hesitation. He's crashing." That was all it took. They moved in sync, without question. One handed him gloves. Another set up suction. Someone called out vitals while he slipped into a rhythm I'd never seen before, calm, fast, precise. My dad, the man they ignored, dismissed, told to wait, now calling out instructions, working with steady hands, sweat rolling down his temple, but never breaking focus. The air in the room changed. No one asked who he was. No one dared. Because in that moment, they needed him. And he knew exactly what to do. He moved like someone who'd been there before. Not rushed, not frantic, but steady, almost too steady for a man who had collapsed less than an hour ago and was still pale, still sweating, still leaning on the bed with one hand to stay upright. But his voice didn't shake. His hands didn't flinch. And when he gave an instruction, people listened, even if they didn't understand why yet. The younger nurse stood by, holding the suction tube like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to move, waiting for someone to give her permission, even though he already had. The other nurse, the older one, started responding, quickly now, efficiently, like her muscle memory was overriding protocol. She passed him tools. He checked vitals. I could see the way his eyes scanned every line on the monitor, his lips moving slightly as if he was running calculations in his head. He looked more awake than I'd seen him all night. The boy's chest rose, just barely. Then it dipped again, alarmingly slow. "We need to get a line in," my dad said, low and controlled. "Now." The nurse hesitated. "Sir, I don't even know who you are." He didn't look at her when he said it. "Right now, I'm the one trying to keep him breathing. If you want to talk titles, we can do that later." She blinked, then nodded, and moved. But I saw it, that look in her eyes. A mix of fear and something else. Recognition, maybe. Like a light going on in the back of her mind. The room stayed silent, except for the beeping and the low hum of equipment. It was almost surreal, watching these professionals, people in scrubs who minutes ago had been frozen in place, now orbiting around my dad like he was the center of gravity. One of the nurses finally broke the silence. "What's your background, sir?" My dad didn't answer. He just kept working. She asked again, more carefully this time. "Are you in trauma? Emergency care?" Still nothing. Just silence and action. Then a new voice entered the room, sharper, louder, clipped like a blade. "What is going on here?" A man in a white coat, maybe early 40s, stepped in with the kind of energy that screams authority. Clean shoes. Clean hands. Clipboard under one arm. He looked around the room, then at my dad, who was bent over the boy, working fast, hands moving with precision. The man's eyes narrowed. "Who is this?" No one answered. My dad didn't even look up. The man stepped forward. "You can't be in here. This is a sterile area. You're compromising protocol." Finally, my dad turned his head slightly. "The boy is crashing." There was no one else. "I'm here now," the man snapped. My dad didn't move. "Then scrub in. Otherwise, you're wasting time." For a moment, I thought it was going to explode, that the man in the coat would yell, throw him out, call security. But he didn't. He just stood there, frozen. And I could tell, he was watching my dad's hands. Not his face. Not his clothes. His hands. And something about the way they moved told him everything he needed to know. He didn't argue again. Instead, he put the clipboard aside, stepped forward to my dad and they started doing something together. No badge. No title. No explanation. Just the quiet surrender of someone who realized, maybe too late, that the man he tried to stop might be the only reason that boy would make it through the night. The boy's breathing was still uneven, but something in the room had shifted. The machines kept beeping, but their rhythm wasn't panicked anymore. My dad moved calmly, deliberately, like he had done this 1,000 times before, maybe he had, and the nurses around him were no longer questioning or hesitating, they were just, responding, following, as if whatever invisible line that separated staff from patient had quietly dissolved in the tension of those last minutes. The man in the white robe stood beside the couch, his gaze fixed on my father's every movement, as if he were studying him, no longer out of suspicion but out of curiosity, maybe even out of respect, though his pride made him stiff, unwilling to admit that someone else had stepped in and done what he couldn't, or wouldn't, do. I stood by the wall, silent, watching the scene unfold like I was the only one seeing it for what it really was. These people didn't just misjudge a man. They nearly lost 2 lives tonight because of it, and one of them was still trying to fix what they broke. Eventually, my dad pulled off his gloves with a slow, tired motion, dropped them in the bin, and stepped back from the bed. His breathing was heavier now, like the adrenaline was starting to wear off, like his body was reminding him that he wasn't supposed to be standing, much less performing under pressure. He leaned against the bed for a second, one hand gripping the rail, the other rubbing at the line where his floor had once been. The nurse, the older one, the one who'd helped him without question, came closer, voice quiet but not unsure. "He's stable," she said. "You bought us time." He nodded once, didn't say anything back. "You saved him." Still no answer. Just a slow blink, like he was trying to stay on his feet without showing how hard that really was. Then she asked the question the whole room had been dancing around. "Who are you and where do you work?" There was a pause. Then, softly, without pride, without drama, he said, "Memorial. Trauma wing. 17 years. And just like that, everything made sense. I saw how it struck the nurses and the doctor, still standing by the couch. They hadn't ignored just another patient tonight. They ignored a trauma surgeon. A man who has probably seen more of these operations than anyone in this building. A man who'd probably saved more lives than he could remember. A man who'd trained people like them, and been tossed aside because of how he looked when he walked in the door. We wheeled him back to his room in silence. My mom stayed on one side, me on the other, and no one stopped us this time. The halls were quieter now. No shouting. No rushing. Just the low buzz of fluorescent lights and machines behind closed doors. When we reached the room, a nurse was already there fixing the sheets, and she looked up when we entered, her expression different than before, careful now, maybe even apologetic. She didn't say anything, just nodded and stepped aside so we could settle him back into the bed. Once he lay back, he closed his eyes for a long moment, and I thought maybe he'd fallen asleep. But then he said, barely above a whisper, "It's not about proving anything. It's about not letting people pay the price for someone else's assumptions." I didn't answer. I just sat beside him and looked at the monitors, now steady, slow, safe. The morning light hadn't even touched the windows yet when the door opened again. It was quiet, hesitant, the kind of knock that says, "I know I'm not welcome, but I came anyway." My mom and I were both half asleep in the uncomfortable chairs by my dad's bed, but he was awake, of course, his eyes already open, watching the ceiling like it held questions only he could answer. The door creaked as it swung wider, and in stepped the nurse. Not the older one, the younger one from before. The one who'd stood frozen while he collapsed. The one who asked for his background, like credentials would make her feel better about everything she didn't do. She was holding a clipboard, but it was more of an excuse than a purpose. "I just came to update your chart," she said quietly, almost like she was afraid her own voice would offend him. My dad nodded, not unkindly, but not warm either. He sat up a little, adjusted the blanket himself, and didn't say a word. She wrote something, hesitated, then spoke again. "Your labs look good," she said. "No signs of damage. The EKG's clean." He nodded again. I didn't know," she said. "We didn't know. I mean. You didn't ask," he said simply. She froze. There was no anger in his voice. Just a fact. A hard, inescapable one. "I wasn't looking for special treatment," he added after a while. "Just the same kind of urgency you give to anyone else who walks into the house needing help and unable to breathe." She stood there, holding that clipboard like it weighed more than it should, and for a long moment, no one said anything. Then she quietly stepped back, nodded, and left the room. I don't think we saw her again. Later that morning, the man in the white coat returned, not with a team, not with a speech, just alone, like someone who didn't know what to say but felt like he had to say something anyway. He stood at the end of the bed, looked at my dad like he was trying to remember every detail of his face, as if engraving it into memory would somehow undo the night before. I looked up your name, he finally said. You were listed as head of trauma until last year. My dad didn't respond. I read your file, the man continued. Your publications. Your numbers. You've saved more people than most of us combined. Still silence. Then the man said something that surprised even me. If you're ever interested in consulting, teaching, anything, I'd be honored to have you here. My dad smiled, not wide, just enough for the doctor to see it, and said, I already did my years. Now I'm just trying to make it to retirement in one piece. The man nodded, then turned to leave, but paused at the door. For what it's worth. I'm sorry we didn't see you sooner. And that was it. We were discharged later that afternoon. The staff, once indifferent, now looked at us with that careful politeness reserved for VIPs, but it didn't feel right. It wasn't earned. It wasn't respect. It was regret, dressed up to look like professionalism. As we pushed my dad through the front doors in his wheelchair, the same nurse from the waiting room, the one who told us to sign in and wait, stood behind the desk, eyes following us, her mouth drawn into a thin line. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her silence was loud enough. Outside, the sun was warm. My mom opened the car door, and I helped my dad into the passenger seat that he moved slowly, carefully, each movement reminding me that even heroes need help. Before I closed the door, I asked him the question that had been stuck in my throat since last night. Why didn't you tell them who you were? He looked at me for a long moment, eyes steady. Because if I have to explain my worth before they'll treat me like a person, he said, then nothing I say will ever matter. And I understood. Not just the words, but the weight behind them. That night, my father didn't save a life to prove a point. He did it because someone needed help. Because that's what he's always done. And the people who failed him? They'll remember it, whether they say it out loud or not. Because sometimes, the most powerful lesson isn't delivered in anger, or revenge, or even in words.